Part of the Sony lore is the great story of how Akio Morita, one of its founders, refused in 1955 to make a radio for another company that would have not the Sony brand on it, but instead that other company's brand. Making products that bear other brand names is a common practice, but Sony refused. This is the lore, anyway, and I'll tell you that full story in a few minutes, but we're looking today at a Zenith radio that seems to contradict this part of Sony mythology, because this Zenith is so Sony-like that I always suspected that Sony made it for Zenith. We'll look it over closely and compare it to the Sony model most similar, and see what we see. We'll also look at another product, a rather famous one introduced in 1991, said to have been made by Sony that appeared with another brand on it. It's a brand you've definitely heard of later in the video. But first, let's look this Zenith over. It's model R25Y1. One of the key similarities to the Sony is the unusual way this antenna rod folds down and kind of tucks into the side of the cabinet. You just don't see that on radios other than Sony's, usually. This gray business at the end of the antenna rod is not original. When I got this radio, it was missing its antenna tip, and the point was pretty sharp. So I molded a piece of epoxy putty over it. Was the original tip one of those very Sony-looking ruby red plastic tips? I don't know. That would have been a convincing clue as to whether or not Sony made this Zenith. But without the original tip here, I don't know. Wait a minute. Maybe I have another one of these Zeniths. I'll go look for it while you look at Zenith pictures. I'll be right back. Oh yeah, look at this. It's another Zenith R25Y1, and in the case even. The back is black, just like on the other one, but the grill of this one is darker. Maybe the other one faded, while this one has been tucked away in its case. So, about that antenna tip, it's not a ball, and it's not translucent ruby-colored either, so it's not going to support the argument in favor of Sony being the OEM, original equipment maker, of this Zenith. Still, this tip could have been added, like my gray epoxy one, and not even be original. Unlikely, though. On the back it says, Zenith, Hong Kong. Well, if Sony made it, it would say Japan, right? Well, no, not necessarily. Sony had at least one factory in Hong Kong, so that doesn't prove anything one way or the other, either. As we get inside, we see the transistors are marked not Sony, but Hitachi. Oh. Well, it's looking like Sony did not make this Zenith. Well, there's only one thing left to do, and that is to get a hold of one of those similar Sony models and look inside of it. Sony made a few similar models, AM/FM models, like the Zenith, the most similar Sonys being this TFM 850W from around 1965 and this 3F66W from around 1972. I'll go and get that 3F66W model, since it appears to be the most like the Zenith. While I go look for it, here's that great story I promised you, from Sony's early days. This is from Akio Morita's book on the history of Sony, called Made in Japan, published in 1986. He relates the 1955 story of what happened when he first offered a Sony transistor radio for distribution in the United States. And I quote, "Our first transistor radio of 1955 was small and practical. We were very proud of it. The people at Bulova liked the radio very much, and their purchasing officer said very casually, 'We definitely want some of these. We will take 100,000 units.' 100,000 units? I was stunned. It was an incredible order, worth several times the total capital of our company. We began to talk details, my mind working very fast, when he told me that there was one condition. We would have to put the Bulova name on the radios. That stopped me. I had vowed that we would not be an original equipment maker for other companies. We wanted to make a name for our company on the strength of our own products. I told him I would check with my company, and in fact I did send a message back to Tokyo outlining the deal. The reply was, "Take the order." I didn't like the idea, and I didn't like the reply. After thinking it over and over, I decided I had to say, no, we would not produce radios under another name. When I returned to call on the man from Bulova, he didn't seem to take me seriously at first. How could I turn down such an order? He was convinced I would accept. When I would not budge, he got short with me. "Our company name is a famous brand name that has taken over 50 years to establish," he said. "Nobody has ever heard of your brand name. Why not take advantage of ours?" I understood what he was saying, but I had my own view. 50 years ago, I said, your brand name must have been just as unknown as our name is today. I am here with a new product, and I am now taking the first step for the next 50 years of my company. 50 years from now, I promise you that our name will be just as famous as your company name is today. I never regretted the decision not to take what is called an original equipment maker, OEM, order, because the decision gave me added confidence and pride. Although when I told Ibuka and the other executives back in Tokyo what I had done, some of them thought I was foolish. But I said then, and I have said it often since, it was the best decision I ever made. End quote. Okay, I've got the Sony radio. Well, it's an 8-transistor, like the Zenith. Unlike the Zenith, it has a battery door, which I can't seem to get to stay on. The Zenith has a one-piece back held on by tabs. To remove the Sony's back, 2 screws have to come out. Inside, the Zenith and Sony chassis are completely different. We would assume to find Sony-branded transistors in the Sony, not Hitachi's, like we found in the Zenith. So what do we find? Well, the transistors in the Sony are branded Sanyo. I didn't see that coming. Well, what does this prove? Probably nothing. Learning stuff is what I like best about collecting. But sometimes what you learn is you don't know. That's something. In the same way that 0 is a number. It's nothing, but it's something. So, what about that other product from 1991 I mentioned? I've heard it was designed and made by Sony, but appeared with another brand on it, a brand that has since grown larger even than Sony. Apple. But let's back up a second. Here's Apple's first laptop, the Macintosh Portable, made by Apple in the U.S. It sold new in 1989 for $6,500, and it weighed 16 pounds. It didn't sell well. For their next attempt at a laptop, Apple sought with the Powerbook 100 a little help from Sony. I've heard everything from Sony designed and built it and Apple stuck their name on it, to Apple built it, but Sony helped Apple to miniaturize the components. I've heard both of these completely conflicting claims from otherwise quite reliable sources. Well, let's just see where this Powerbook 100 says it was made. Man, this thing is heavy. It says here, made in USA. Okay, but that still doesn't rule out Sony if they had a plant in the USA then. And yes, they'd built their first U.S. plant in 1972. Well, I've got one more thing to check. Another Powerbook 100 that I happen to have. Let's look at it and see if it can clarify matters. Oh, no. Quite the opposite. This one says, assembled in Ireland. Ireland. Did Sony have a plant in Ireland? Well, yes. They'd had a plant in Shannon, Ireland since 1960. So that weighs in favor of Sony making Apple's Powerbook 100. Unless Apple also had a factory in Ireland. What are the odds of that? Well, it seems that, yes, Apple did have a factory in Ireland then, and still does. It doesn't look like we're going to get any certainty on this question either. Akio Morita's decision, which he considered the best decision he ever made, not to let Sony be an OEM for other brands, seems to have held. Though they look so similar, we see no proof that Sony made this Zenith. Though many have asserted that Sony made the Powerbook 100 for Apple, we see no proof here either. In the absence of any evidence to the contrary that I can see, the Sony lore still stands.